Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, the Health Minister says the post-mortem of all people who perished in the Joburg fire will be concluded by tomorrow. But concern remains on the DNA testing of the mortal remains of the people who were burnt beyond recognition. Over 30 people are in hospital, 2 of them being children, with 2 patients in ICU. The death toll now stands at 76. Only 12 bodies are identifiable. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Mr. Volker van Widden. He's head of risk organization Riskonet. Mr. van Widden, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. Now, we had also invited SIRI as an NGO, but perhaps to start with just that conversation. NGOs, which are celebrated for their selfless work, are now being inserted in this whole conversation around immigration, which stems from that very tragic incident. Your views just on the conversation having morphed into something else, some sort of a blame game?
It is difficult. Obviously, I can't comment on behalf of NGOs and the work they do. Obviously, they respond to the laws of the country, and they've exercised those laws. And as we've heard in summary terms, that in order for an eviction to take place, there has to be an alternative accommodation plan. Mm-hmm. I think there are many other elements to that. So I think the first thing starts with, what were the underlying conditions? So if we're talking about the eviction of people from a building that has been hijacked, then how was the building hijacked in the first place? And I think then the conversation about what are the consequences of eviction, they follow that. So I'd rather, start the conversation with what are the conditions that led to the problem in the first place. Then obviously we can't comment on what the NGOs are doing in their own right.
Mm-hmm. And then let's talk about the infrastructure conversation. Now, you would have heard Minister Zulu attributing the issues to apartheid. But if we remember correctly, at one point, Herman Mashaba, in this new dispensation, had started a program to rejuvenate the inner city, releasing a great number of the city's buildings to the private sector through partnership with government. We all know that capital is something that government doesn't have in abundance. Would some sort of a continuation of such a partnership lead to addressing some of the issues that need to be dealt with in the inner city?
Absolutely. And of course, one can generalize, but I think making sweeping points about whether it was or wasn't apartheid doesn't really solve the problem. There are many other cities, starting with New York, that had urban decay, and they fixed it. And they fixed it one building at a time and one area at a time. It takes a plan and willpower to execute without hurting the people unnecessarily. Mm-hmm. So this is about a straightforward, practical issue about applying standards and applying those standards one building at a time, renovating the buildings, bringing proper accommodation into play. And then it's got nothing to do with political issues. There's an enormous demand for accommodation. And it doesn't mean that people then have to be charged, excessive rates. But there's more than enough people willing to participate and pay rental at reasonable rates for renovated buildings and accommodation.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you touch on, apologies for interjecting there, I'm glad that you touch on the rate, the amount that people would have to pay, because when we talk privatization or part privatization or some sort of partnership, there's that fear that where you're going to include the private sector, they are for profit, perhaps the type of rent they would be charging would be far too high for any of the people within the inner city to afford.
It's possible, but we don't know that. And I think that's part of the generalizations. So we look at it from a risk management point of view. If you just say there's a sweeping generalization that all privatization is wrong because the rents will be too high, you won't make progress. If you renovate one building at a time and say 20% of the building will have subsidized rentals, and the city will subsidize those rentals to qualifying people, and the balance of the building will have economic rentals, then there's more than enough capital that will be available to renovate that building and have an economic and sustainable plan for that building. Mm-hmm. So there are many practical ways in which the risk of a hijacked building can be removed by a constructive partnership with private capital and the needs of the community. And private capital is very sensitive to the needs of community and will then moderate its prices from time to time. Mm-hmm. So making these sweeping generalizations is actually unproductive.
Mm-hmm. So would you confine this to then just a situation where government lacked the innovation here to utilize money which is in the private hands to fix the problems of the inner city?
Well, I wouldn't call it innovation. I'd first of all say, starting with the standards, a building should never be hijacked. If as we heard, this building had been expropriated. It was owned by the city 10, 20 years ago, and they should have shuttered it. Shuttered doesn't mean just putting a simple lock on the door, which will be broken by anybody. Shuttering means shuttering with steel gates and the rest, and then you build that building again carefully with the right thing. So that's about a plan, willpower, and executing your mandate. Then you go back to the private sector and saying, hey, we've got an asset. How do we partner together and go forward? And there are many, many ways in which the private sector wants to participate. Student housing is one example. There's a huge demand for student housing in many areas of the cities. So, and there are billions of capital that wanted to put money into that. So there's more than enough reason why private capital will go in and complement a subsidized basis on which these buildings can be renovated and provided back to the community.
All right, Mr. Volker, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's Volker van Widden. He's head of strategic risk organization Risconet.
You're welcome.
All right, to this story now. The expelled former ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule says the new political party he has founded will accommodate the politically wary and those abused by the current political system. Magashule was speaking at the launch of his party in Soweto earlier. After months of speculation, the former Secretary General of the governing party has added another party to the already crowded political space ahead of the 2024 elections. Joining us for more on this is political analyst Tessa Dooms. Tessa, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Many, when hearing this announcement, said it was not unexpected. They did expect some sort of announcement that the former Secretary General would be forming a political party. But what did you make of just that announcement nevertheless?
Well, I think the announcement was telling in two important ways. One is that Ace Magashule believes that he has taken a constituency with him from the ANC. I think that's the clearest indication.
But is it
of that constituency that will follow him?
Tessa, but is it a significant constituency? Because that has also now been the conversation, that how much of a dent would this have on the African National Congress? Is it just perhaps confined to Free State? What are we looking at here?
Well, I mean, only time can really tell, and I think that's what he's trying to test out himself. He believes it's a significant constituency, and he's going to have to test that out in reality. The truth is that the way the ANC operates is that people don't just gravitate towards individuals. They gravitate towards centers of power. Many people in the ANC will very quickly reorganize themselves in their allegiances once somebody doesn't have access to power. Power, in the ways in which it's access to the state and the power of the state, access to resources, access to influence. And so that's what ACE is going to be testing, whether or not people will follow him as an individual in terms of both ideologically what he stands for, at least purports to stand for, and in terms of the influence that he still holds. And that's why he's doing it so quickly, because he doesn't want his influence to wane any further than it already has. But the ANC has got a remarkable knack of people reorienting themselves within the party to new centers of power. And that's why it's really difficult actually to get a bona fide breakaway that is actually substantive.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because when we look at the power or influence that he still has, I remember quite vividly at his first appearance in Bloemfontein, a number of the political seniors within the ANC were there, Malusi Gigaba, Mzwandile Masina. We were physically there and we saw them. It was crowded. But as the months progressed, we saw little of those individuals, particularly the seniors in the party, and it continued in that trajectory until this very moment, where really somebody that was notable was Bernie Klemeza, that he was standing with now when having his address. So what does that suggest about when one is out of power or out of the ANC?
Well, there are two ANC examples of breakaways that have been relatively successful. COPE was the first and the EFF is the second. And in both of those cases, it took a group of ANC leaders all deciding to go at the same time towards the same vehicle. And you saw also, especially actually in both those cases, where you saw the repurposing of existing ANC branches as they were, quite quickly reorienting themselves towards the EFF or COPE at the time, and then having the wherewithal, the resources and the money and the ground game, as it were, quite quickly to take that and move that into an election. Now, what we will have to see from an Uys Magashule in the next few months is a very strong show of ground support. I would say that probably the Free State would be the place where he would hope that he has the strongest showing. But in order for him to make any kind of dent into the election, taking away support from the ANC, he needs more than just a logo. He's going to need resources and I think more people from the ANC than himself who have actually gone in this direction.
And then on the ideology here, it seems that his will be a more transformative agenda, similar to an ATM of Violetto Zungula, also the EFF as well. So one would say they are somewhat like-minded political parties. I mean, when it comes down to it, the electorate, looking at these three parties that I've just mentioned, all pushing that transformation agenda, how easy, though, would it be for him to get quite a lot of support? What distinguishes his political party from the ATM, for instance?
What I will say is that people in South Africa do not vote on ideology. At most, they vote on issues. And the thing that drives people are the issues on the table. Ideology and all of that is important for the framing of political programs. And I think any party that has a real interest in governance needs to have an ideological framing that will guide it going into the future. But when it comes to the voter is not going to ask you how far left are you. The voter is going to ask you what is your plan of action on issue 1 or issue 2. The voter is also going to be either heartened by or skeptical of you in terms of your ability to organize. So that's why we saw the EFF do that big show of force a few weeks ago. Because voters don't want to feel like their vote is going to go to someone who will make no impact. And so voters are looking at those two things. What are the issues on the table? And do you have enough support outside of me for my vote to be meaningful if I put it with you? Who are the other people that are in this ambit? And so the ideological positioning of a party is really the secondary thing. People really want to know what issues are you going to tackle? Are you looking to tackle issues that I care about? And he's speaking particularly about disenfranchised, poor black communities. He's going to have to compete for the hearts and minds of those communities with real implementable change and real organizing ability.
Tessa, thank you very much for your insights. So less ideology, more issues. You basically summarized, Amilcar Cabral, for us that it's not the ideas in someone's mind. So it would be just the practical issues of the day-to-day that many people are faced with. Thank you very much yet again. And unfortunately, that's where we leave it for today. We're back tomorrow. Have a wonderful day further.